All right, welcome back to Sketchy Talk. This is our ninth episode, and today we have Marley Peifer. He is a nature journaler and an educator with over 10 years of teaching nature journal expeditions on 3 continents and more than 200 free educational videos online. He longs for a reintegration of art with science with words and images, a synthesis that he develops in his journals. Nature journaling became a fundamental practice for Marley when he discovered how it could synthesize his interests and accelerate his learning. As an educator, Marley is constantly sharing, inspiring, and provoking learning in nature and on paper. So welcome, Marley. It's great to finally talk to you.
Yay!
I know, we've been trying to plan this for a while, but you've been in Costa Rica and Panama and where else?
I think I was in the Galapagos when you first reached out to me.
Ah, wow. That's cool.
Yeah, so I'm glad to be on the show and everything, and can't wait to talk about sketching or nature journaling or anything that you want to talk about.
Okay, great. Well, when did you start your nature journaling journey?
I think that I first started nature journaling, or I first learned about nature journaling in about 2013 or 2014. I was actually applying for a science illustration graduate program, and as part of my application, and research process, all, I emailed about 30 alumni, and one of them was John Muir Laws, and he responded and offered to, give me some help with my application for the science illustration program. And then I learned about the work that he did and nature journaling from him. He was still working on publishing his book at that point, and I started nature journaling and liked it so much. I didn't get into the science illustration program, but decided I wanted to do more nature journaling instead of science illustration anyway. So it was perfect.
When did you decide to start traveling and going to the Galapagos in South America? When did you make that decision and how did you get there?
Yeah, so I think that I was doing my business planning. I usually do a business planning session every year
Mhm.
around in between Christmas and New Year. And in the last round of that I was doing, I was just sort of looking at where my costs were. So there was a little bit of an economic analysis there, financial analysis, and then um, I also knew that I was going to be going to the Galapagos and Costa Rica anyways to lead nature journaling trips, and I decided that instead of flying that far away for a week and then flying back to California and paying rent in California that whole time, that I could just stay in those places longer, and why not just stay a lot longer and not have to fly back and forth between North America and South America. So then I little by little started piecing together a plan for how I can extend that and how I
Mhm.
could do some collaborations down there. And so I ended up collaborating with quite a few organizations and teaching nature journaling in a lot of different places. So it ended up being really rich and really good practice and really fun.
What kind of tools have you found? Because you were doing it almost looked like zip lining or climbing trees and that sort of thing. Tell me about some of these adventures.
Yeah, so the most recent thing that I did, I learned about it partway through last year, but I had already been thinking that it would be, I like sketching and nature journaling in extreme conditions. And I find that it helps me focus, I think. I love working in the studio as well, but I think there's so many distractions in the studio, and a lot of times it's easy to kind of lose the immediacy of the sketch. And I find it so much more invigorating to sketch or nature journal in real life, whether that's like a crowded market, maybe, or like an urban sketching kind of situation, or a biodiverse rainforest where there's tons of different butterflies, lizards, flowers, and all kinds of stuff happening around you all at the same time. And so um, I've nature journaled in a lot of different kind of extreme things like that. And for a long time, I was trying to develop some sort of more amphibious note taking and sketching techniques, and really curious about how to take nature journaling and sketching like under the water even. I think coral reefs, for example, are a really important place. Um, in terms of biodiversity and biodiversity loss.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
partway through last year, I decided that a similar ecosystem to the coral reefs that is still extremely challenging to sketch in, but that might be easier in a lot of ways because you're not underwater, would be the rainforest canopy. So the rainforest canopy is extremely understudied. Scientists have only been climbing up there in the last like 35 to 40 years. So it's one of these places on Earth that is extremely important to the entire life supporting capacity of the planet. And there's a ton of biodiversity, and a lot of those things are going extinct before we even realize that they're there. So I like to combine art and nature journaling with like meaning. Like I think that nature journaling and art can be more than just hobbies. And I think that they can actually play a role in conserving and helping protect and educate about these unique and endangered ecosystems. So I signed up when I learned about several coincidences lined up. Um, and I found out about a intensive month-long course in canopy access techniques that was going to be taking place in this archipelago off of the east coast of Panama. And so I just signed up for the class, and I went, and that's where I just was. And it's really challenging physically, climbing up there. And there's lots of biting insects, and it's extremely hot and humid. And so then trying to sketch in that situation as well, and it's like if you've ever had the experience of dropping your pen or the pen cap falling or something like that, it's like, you're in some cases like 25 meters up in this tree, and the ground is completely covered in leaves and vines and ferns. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you can't, if you drop something, even if you're standing on the ground, you won't find it, but much less when you're way up in the tree. So that was, and then everything, you're sweating, and sweat is getting on the paper. Certain inks don't work, and things like that. So that
Mm-hmm.
was very exciting. And on my YouTube channel, just the night before last, one of the videos came out where I was nature journaling up there, and I got to see some poison dart frogs
Oh,
way up in
nice.
the trees. Yeah, so and do some sketches of them. So um that's the most recent adventure. But it sounded like you
Hmm.
wanted to talk about materials and supplies a little
Oh,
bit
we can
too.
talk about a little bit of everything. It's funny. I remember when I was in Costa Rica, I did a picture and I decided to use that watercolor technique where you put salt on it, and it
Mm,
took 3 days for it to dry.
yeah,
Because the salt kept drawing more moisture out of the air. And, you don't usually think of watercolors taking that long to dry, but that's just the sort of consideration if you're in that type of rainforest environment you have to think about.
absolutely, absolutely. The other thing that happens too is that certain watercolors, I don't know if it has to do with the amount of gum arabic they have in them, but certain
Mm-hmm.
watercolors in high humidity, they just start to get really soft in your palette. And then you
Mm-hmm.
can get this effect where they just start melting out of the little squares and
Mm-hmm.
causing this huge mess in your palette. And I've been in situations before where every night I'm like holding my palette over a campfire trying to like dry it out,
Mm-hmm.
or finding certain places next to the roof that are drier,
Mm-hmm.
and just trying to do that, because that's an uh, extremely challenging situation when, and then also if you touch your brush to the color, a lot of times it will pick up a huge amount. Though they just behave very differently in
Mm-hmm.
high humidity.
Yeah, I would think. So what are your go-to tools then? Do you mostly try to stick with dry media then when you're
Um, I try to push things to their absolute breaking limit. So my go-to kit has basically been the same for the last um most of it has been the same for the last almost 7 years, but some
mm-hmm.
things have probably changed in the last 3 years. But I have a watercolor palette from John Muir Laws that I use
Mm-hmm.
all the time, and I just think that it's the easiest and quickest way to get color in the field, and get a
Mm-hmm.
wide variety of color in the field. I don't carry anything else. And in the studio, even I almost use nothing else anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
I 100% use the Pentel water brushes,
Mm-hmm. Those
the
are great.
the large size. Yeah, and that way I don't have to carry water into the field in a separate container because I often work standing up or crouching
Mm-hmm.
or hanging from a harness. You can't have a water container with you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's for my color. And I try to use that even if it's slightly drizzling, I'll still try to use that. And then as far as everything else, I really draw almost I prefer to draw with these Pilot Fudayaku pins. They have gray on one side and black on the other side, and they're sort of like
Oh,
a
interesting.
modified, yeah, they're like a modified brush pin. They're not actual bristles, but the nibs behave in a brush-like way, and I think they're often called brush pins. But Pilot Fudayaku, and they have gray on one end, which I love. I love that, and black on the other. They are technically waterproof, so you can, once it's fully dry, you can do watercolor over it,
Mm-hmm.
and you can also just draw straight with them. You can get a fair amount of line variation, which I like. So that's my main drawing tool. The gray is also really fun for sort of more tentative sketches, or you can even use it as an underdrawing on
Mm-hmm.
my landscape sketches and my urban sketching. I'll often start with the gray of that pen, and then I'll go over it with watercolor. And it is subtle enough that it almost looks like a direct watercolor painting.
Mm-hmm.
And if you
Mm-hmm.
want, you can always add black ink over it. But I love that. And then it also gives me a visual hierarchy, which is super important for nature journaling and composition in general. I love visual hierarchy. So because the
Mm-hmm.
gray ink is a lighter value, I can do some of my notes and some of my drawings in that, and then some of my other
Mm-hmm.
ones in black, and it automatically gives me this visual hierarchy on the page. So those two, between that watercolor palette, and water brushes, and the Pilot Fudayaku, that's really my heavy lifters. But I do also play around with some other stuff. But I pretty minimal. So it has to pass a lot of criteria to make it into my field kit or even
Mm-hmm.
into my studio kit now because I keep things minimal. But I do play around with the Fude Demonin calligraphy pen by
Mm.
Sailor. It's the green one, and it has a nib, a bent nib, so you can actually use it in one direction. It's a really fine line, and you use it in the other direction. It puts down a ton of ink, and I love being able to put down a lot of black fast. And
Mm-hmm.
I've refitted it with a converter so that I can put a waterproof ink in, and I use the carbon platinum ink in there, and
Nice.
that's just a really fun pen. It's so fun to draw with that and write with it as well. Really fun. And I carried that around in a little glass jar with ink in it. I forget how many cubic centimeters of ink, but I carried that around in my backpack for the last 7 months while traveling. So it had to be worth it because that's a risky thing to carry around
I was
in a
gonna say you
backpack.
can't really fly, or you have to like pack it in your. I don't know if you check your luggage or anything
Yeah,
like that.
check luggage.
That's always the other thing is what you're allowed to bring into different countries and stuff like that.
Yep.
I mean that's why. I mean, when I was doing my book and we were thinking about the Kickstarter. That's why I'm gonna have to get your address so I can send you
Hmm.
because we made these. My husband keeps getting all these 3D printers, and he's a former toy
Hmm.
designer. Well, he still does design toys, but he used to be at Kenner Toys and stuff
Hmm.
like that. So I did a little sketch because I like really tiny palettes. So I have this
Yeah,
little tiny palette that it holds 6 colors, but it also
that
has
is tiny.
yeah, and I developed it for when you go to museums. A lot of times now they don't
Oh,
let you
yes.
carry anything
Yep.
liquid, and so this
Yep.
actually has a removable clip.
Wow,
It's a
that's
removable
great.
clip, and then also has a clip you can put in that velcros to your hand.
Wow.
So
That's
that
like
like,
James Bond.
yeah, so we've been selling a lot of them. It was really fun to think, because some people are like, "Oh, you should make something bigger." And I said, "Well, that's not the point. The point is so that
Yeah.
you can just either attach it to your sketchbook or to your hand, and you won't drop it." Because I drop stuff all the time, like when
Yes.
I'm in museums or like when I'm outside or whatever. And so this attaches my paint to me. And with a water brush, then you don't need that much, because, like you said, a lot of times you're places that it's not easy to carry stuff.
Absolutely.
I mean, I
Yeah.
found when I've been in areas like that, I tend to do more ink work and that sort of thing, because it's a little
Hmm.
bit harder to carry, because the water takes a long
Yes.
time to dry and that sort of thing.
Definitely. The weird thing that I've noticed is like I don't have all my stuff with me right now. I should have, but since it's not a video anyways, it's probably fine. I'll have to use words to describe it. But the John Muir Laws watercolor palette is probably like 12 inches long. So it's not it's a field palette because you can put your thumb in it, but it's not that small. But the weird thing is I've experimented with like some art toolkit stuff, and the art toolkit stuff is small, and like I have a small sketchbook and a small watercolor palette, but it actually is harder for me if I'm not sitting down, I can't use that palette. So like the palette doesn't have a thumb hole, and even though it's smaller than my John Muir Laws one, it and combined even with the smaller sketchbook, it's not actually more portable. Like
Yeah,
once I'm
yeah.
actually using it, like unless I'm sitting or have a flat surface to work on. So sometimes just something being smaller doesn't actually
Hmm.
make it easier to manipulate. And like the same with my sketchbook. So I use a relatively large sketchbook in the field, and I prefer that. It's a 9 by 12. So
Hmm.
it's basically the length of my forearm, but I can hold it in the crook of my forearm, and then I can
Hmm.
hold my watercolor palette, and that gives me one completely free hand. If I'm using like the art toolkit palette, which I
Hmm.
love their stuff by the way, but unless I'm like clipping things all together, it still ends up covering part of my sketchbook, and then
Hmm.
it's sometimes that's why that little palette that clips onto your finger, that makes sense. But sometimes I think people assume just because it's smaller, it's more portable when you actually are in the field. And I don't find that necessarily to be the case. Like the size isn't everything. And like my 9 by 12 with that watercolor palette, I've crawled through bushes,
Hmm.
in East Africa following hunter-gatherers with that setup. I've been up in trees now,
Hmm.
what far off the ground with that setup. I've been on kayaks with that setup.
Hmm.
So unless it's really, really wet, if it's really, really wet, what I do now is I use a Write in the Rain sketchbook, and I can't remember
Hmm.
the dimensions, but it's about a quarter of the size of my full size
Hmm. Hmm.
sketchbook, and maybe it's like 4 inches by 6 inches or something like that. And it's a waterproof paper, and I use a Prismacolor ebony pencil. So it's a graphite pencil, a really nice, soft, very dark graphite
Hmm.
pencil. And that combination, I can go underwater with that and pull it back
Hmm.
out, or it can be raining. I can't do color. If I use colored pencils, I would be able to. I've seen even on the Write in the Rain website, they have like some urban sketcher who uses it
Yeah,
and
I just
shows
saw
how
a
she
video of
uses. Have you
someone
seen
the
that?
other day. Yeah, I have. My practice is mostly urban sketching. I do
Hmm.
some, perhaps, nature journaling. I mean, most of my illustration practice, actually, interestingly, is doing books about. I've done a lot of books about nature. I did a book for the U.S. Forest Service and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation about elk, and I've done books
Oh,
on bison.
nice.
And
Hmm.
I just my latest book, which is actually about the rainforest, is a children's book called Sloth's Treehouse Inn, was done for the San Diego Zoo.
Mm.
So I've done a lot of books that are nature, nature and science and education oriented. So I'm fascinated by the nature journal practice, even though more of what I do is urban sketching. And this is a good segue into the art of observation, because when you take pictures of stuff, you don't get the detail that you need. And when you sketch something, even if it's not necessarily beautiful or completely accurate, at least you're observing it in a way that your brain will remember it in imprints. And when you make notes and observations, that actually is more powerful than if you snap a quick picture of it.
Yes, and I think this is a place where we've sort of lost in the greater society today, in most of the world, I would say, we sort of lost this idea that drawing is a learning tool. So like on the wall behind me, there's like a painting. And most people think like of drawing as a decorative tool. It's, and that's what everybody thinks about is like, oh, this drawing is to look pretty. It's to go on a wall. It's to display this. But what has been forgotten for the most part, and there's still some bastions of outlying places where they're still teaching drawing as a learning tool and new resurgent ones such as the nature journaling movement. But it's mostly been forgotten that drawing is also a learning tool. And that's the part that I'm actually more interested in. I mean, I love art. Don't get me wrong. I love beauty. I love creating aesthetic pages. And I think that there's a communication value. If something looks good, it often means it's able to communicate more successfully as well. But the learning tool, and I think just being able to develop the language to distinguish between when drawing is a learning tool or when I want to use it as a learning tool and when I'm creating a decoration is really essential, and it's very lacking from what I see. And so then people get confused about what they're doing, and then they're judging themselves automatically based on the
Exactly.
decorative value of their drawing.
Hmm.
And then that creates the whole thing, the whole paradoxical thing where it's like if you're focused on the decorative value of the drawing and you're just getting started, you're going to have so many psychological obstacles that you won't put in the practice to actually improve the decorative value of your drawing. But if you're focused on using drawing as a learning tool, or you're not really worried about the decorative outcome in those early works, you are going to put in the practice and the decorative aspect of your drawing is going to get better. So it creates this situation. And from my experience teaching, I've been teaching for quite a while. That is the main problem. That, it's like, people don't need to learn how to hold the pencil better, really. People don't really need to learn that much about color mixing. And like all of those things will actually improve automatically through time and practice. However, the
Hmm.
psychological barriers, those don't improve automatically through practice. So it's like those are the ones that as a teacher or as a self-directed learner, those are the ones we need to be attacking. And then just through practice, we will get better at everything else. But everybody can talk more easily about, oh, do this with your watercolor, oh, mix this or get this tool or get that. But people don't talk about the psychological aspects and the barriers. And I think a big one is the lack of language to make this distinction between drawing as a learning tool and drawing as a decorative practice.
Like a visual language. And that is
Hmm.
lacking. And a lot of people need to, backing up a little bit, it seems like when people take up something like drawing or music or something like that, there's always a pressure that, well, you should become good at this and then monetize it rather than looking at it as a practice that's actually has other purposes than just making a living or making a hustle out of it. I mean, you can play music and enjoy music and learn a lot from playing music without having to make it something you get paid for. And with sketching and that sort of thing, I mean, that's what I got into sketching for actually, is because I do so much work that's paid for. Like most of what I do is
Hmm.
kids' books and illustration, and that's my day job. And one thing that actually keeps me loving drawing is sketching and doing urban sketching and just doing something that's just for me. I started doing sketchbooks so I didn't have to do work for someone else. So I could just do it for
Hmm.
me. It wasn't, and it was just experimenting and playing and just finding out why you love drawing again. And
Hmm.
I think as a practice, that's something somebody can really enjoy and be freeing beyond or in addition to the observational component, because I think there's
Hmm.
something about when you're journaling and when you're urban sketching or any type of sketching, you're paying attention to the sounds you hear, the
Hmm.
smells, it makes you much more perhaps hypersensitive in a way to what you're experiencing in
Hmm.
a way that if you're just looking at it or taking pictures of it, that you're not doing because you're paying so much careful attention to that.
Hmm.
Do you find that to be sort of how it is for you? Almost a meditation, a
Yeah,
meditative practice.
absolutely. I think I was going to say mindfulness because it is a mindfulness practice. And I think that's one of the things that one of the benefits people get out of it is a sense of well-being. And, there's tons of studies about how if you go out in nature or even just observe something beautiful for a certain amount of
Hmm.
time, that it has, like real medically measurable benefits on the human mind and body. And so I think that is one of the benefits that people get out of nature journaling or sketching. I mean, even if you're doing like a still life drawing, it's forcing you to be in the present moment. And if that's out in nature or under some trees or whatever, looking at clouds, that's even better. But I think even if you're just sketching, you know, buildings, and it's so funny because when you're sketching, you have to go so much slower than the way people are normally moving through the environment. And it is like meditation. Like people think that, some people can meditate where they actually clear their mind of all thoughts for long periods of time. But for most people, I mean, pretty much everyone, it's this constant back and forth. It's like your mind starts drifting to something else and then you bring it back. And so that's hard for a lot of people to do, and can be kind of boring. But if you're sketching something from life, you're doing the same thing. So instead of just going off on some tangent on what your imagination is coming up with, you keep have to check back with reality and you keep looking at the same thing over and over again. And so I think that's very similar to a meditation practice and a mindfulness, because you're forced to even if it's a building, um, or a cup of water, you keep having to look at that thing again. And I think that's really important. And when I'm teaching drawing, I'm always trying to notice how much students are looking at the subject versus their drawing. And I love drawing from imagination. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's
Hmm.
that feedback loop with reality that's where the learning comes in, because you can draw from your imagination for 10 years and you might just be doing the same things over and over again and you might not really grow. But if you're drawing from life for 10 years, you're going to have a lot of growth, because reality is you're checking in with reality, and there's a feedback loop there between, okay, this is what my drawing looks like. That's what the reality looks like. Let me adjust that ellipse a little bit more because that's not the way ellipses look like in real life, even
Exactly.
though in your
Yeah.
imagination, maybe they do.
So when in most of your practice, when you're teaching students, do you find it's a lot of science students? What is the makeup mostly of are you working with colleges and that sort of thing to do nature journaling? Where do you see the biggest growth in this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Currently, the nature journaling community is mostly retired folks in the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia. And I think that the growth is coming from, and those people are often doing it as a hobby. They're often women. Like I would say right now, it's probably 90%
Really?
women. Women over 50 in the nature journaling community. And so these are people who have, you know, in many cases, made compromises and sacrifices in their lives to help other people, support other people. They've been supporting children, making food for children. They've been
Mm-hmm.
supporting and
Mm-hmm.
helping their spouses, their husbands, and they've reached a point in their life, and they've been, working. They've reached a point in their life now where they want to do things for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and they realize that they love nature. They've always, they maybe as little girls they connected with nature. They love creativity and art, and
Mm-hmm.
so they're kind of having a renaissance in their life where they're reconnecting with nature. They're reconnecting with creativity and doing something for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
instead of for someone else. And that's where the community is right now. And I think it's really beautiful to see that demographic, connect with nature journaling. And I also am very hopeful that nature journaling will spread into some younger communities and more professional realms, and more applied forms of nature journaling. So that's one of my main life goals, is to see nature journaling used in more applied ways. I want to see it as a valuable skill that employers are looking for, that centers for education are teaching, and that teams of like investigators and stuff like that are using, for example. So in the last year, I was teaching nature journaling mostly in Latin America. So Ecuador, Galapagos Islands, and Costa Rica. And in those places, I did notice that I was intentionally targeting younger people, but I did notice that it was a lot more students, like biology students, stuff like that, that I'm trying to reach in those places. I should mention, even though I think the majority of the community is these is retired women in North America, Europe, and Australia, English speaking world for the most part at this point. There is also almost equal to that percentage. I think there's a percentage of homeschool families. So homeschool families and children. So right now, I would say, the nature journaling community, a lot of people think that it's either for kids, or it's sort of like retired people, like a lot of the same people that sign up for watercolor classes and stuff like that. So I think we will see a lot more diversity. We've already seen more diversity in the community in the last few years. Like 5 years ago or something, it was a lot less in the nature journaling community. And I've been teaching nature journaling in Spanish, and also following how nature journaling is being translated into other languages. I've done interviews on the Nature Journal show with people who are doing nature journaling in German, and stuff like that. So I think there's some people doing it in Indonesian. It's growing. So
Yeah,
and I'm
Indonesia is
hopeful.
a huge arts community. I mean, that's one thing that's
Oh,
interesting
really?
about Urban Sketchers is that
Mm,
when you look at the chapters, the Asian chapters are very huge. I mean,
mm-hmm,
in Singapore, I think they get hundreds of people on some of
mm-hmm,
their sketch outings, and also India gets
mm-hmm.
huge amounts. There's a lot of people
Yeah.
that are super into it.
Mm-hmm,
In South America as well. I mean, it's
mm-hmm,
amazing how big these outings are, and you see people of all ages. Whereas where
mm-hmm,
you're describing in the US and some of these things, it skews a little older. And I
mm-hmm.
think it's because a lot of, these areas do value art. I think culturally in India and in South America, a lot of people do have more art. There's more of a culture of art starting younger. And
Mm,
I think in education in the US, like some schools aren't really teaching it that much anymore. And
mm-hmm.
that's sad because, like you said, learning to draw could be compared to learning how to write, which
Yes,
which
it
they're not really
is.
doing that much anymore either. They're really pulling back. My nephew didn't have to learn how to do cursive or
Mm-hmm,
handwriting that much. And so
mm-hmm,
it's interesting to see what will that effect be where people are just typing and not actually
mm-hmm,
hand drawing letters, whether, I
mm,
mean, cursive, who cares about that so much? But I mean, unless you
mm-hmm.
love cursive, I mean, but again, it's the deliberate act of taking something down. Will you remember it more when you take
Yeah.
it physically than by typing it? And I
Mm-hmm,
think that then you lose even more of that visual to hand
mm-hmm.
perception.
Absolutely. I mean, they've done studies on it, and I don't want to be a Luddite. I want to look at like the actual information out there, but there is research on the difference between note taking by hand versus note taking on a computer. And one of the things is, if you're I mean, I think one of the main things actually is that if you are if you can't keep up with if you're typing verbatim what someone is saying, you're not learning the material. If you have to synthesize what they're saying, then you're learning the material better. And I think that's currently, I think, as far as I understand the research, I think that's the main difference between retention, and different note taking styles. So that's not necessarily a difference between typing and handwriting, but writing by hand forces you to synthesize no matter what. You can't keep up with it. So, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how those things pan out. And I do agree, interestingly, that the urban sketching community is much more diverse from what I've seen. I've been to urban sketching events, and then been to nature journaling events in the exact same place. and I was very impressed by how diverse the urban sketching was, and also so much bigger. So I'm very interested in promoting the growth of nature journaling. So I'm always looking at things such as urban sketching and trying to figure out, okay, how can I either infiltrate urban sketching in the city and spread nature journaling, or how can I learn what has made urban sketching grow so much more than nature journaling. So I'm always looking at urban sketching.
Well, I think that it definitely has a place. A lot of people are interested in learning more about the environment that they're in beyond, just the urban landscape. I think there definitely is a lot of fusion that could happen.
Hmm.
Definitely between the two, because they're both different types of observing. One's just perhaps more
Yeah.
close up. It's a macro, maybe macro versus micro in a
Hmm.
way, because,
Yeah.
if you're observing insects or, that sort of thing, and they both involve many of the same tools. So I think
Hmm.
that it definitely could be something that is, especially people that already urban sketch, I would think that it would be something that they would be very interested in.
Yeah,
And
I would. I mean, I feel like I'm sure you've thought about this fair amount, and I feel like I've thought about it a fair amount. But the person who I think has done the best job of thinking about this is Kate Rudder. And
mhm,
she actually, for the Wild Wonder Nature Journaling Conference, she had a graphic where she talked about the differences, in her opinion, between nature journaling and sketching slash urban sketching. And I think she even had sketchnoting on there. And I can't remember it all right now, but she did a really great job of sort of explaining the differences between them. And for me, a lot of it is not really, a lot of it is superficial. So like
mhm, mhm,
if I go on an urban sketching meetup, I'm doing almost exactly the same thing that I would do in a nature journaling situation. And to tell you the truth, the main thing here is the definition of nature. And so
true,
to tell you
true.
the truth, like I went urban sketching in Costa Rica, and there's, epiphytic plants growing on the buildings. And the buildings are made out of, at some point, those are natural materials. There's erosion is happening. There's weather. There's abiotic nature. A lot of times people forget that nature is abiotic as well. So anything that has to do with physics, gravity, weather, temperature, erosion, corrosion, rust, like rust, that's nature. And so it's like
Exactly. Yeah.
nature is everywhere. And then the thing that I think urban sketching can adopt most from nature journaling is some of the practices of page usage. So a lot of times I'll sit down with someone, and recently in Costa Rica, I met an urban sketcher from China, and we were sketching some buildings together. And he would sit down, and he would do his page would be, he would do like a 2-page spread maybe, and it was just one view. One view, and maybe there's a little bit of writing and a date
Mhm.
of the location. So I personally think that like in nature journaling, we've done a really good job of developing ways of using the breaking the page up, which, like if you have any attention, if you're on some kind of attention deficit spectrum, for example, which I think most people are, or you want to capture a busy environment, having like one single snapshot on a page is not really the most productive way to do that. But if you can have little sort of panes with little separate things going on, if you can have like arrows pointing to one part of the building and then zooming in, that to me
Mhm.
is so much more interesting. So when I'm doing urban sketching, I'm often using that approach, and it takes a lot of pressure off of having like one pretty picture, because I'm like, oh, I'm zooming in on this detail of the gargoyle over here. And if my attention changes later, I could draw a couple people here, or like a close up of what this person is doing, or like put in a little a text bubble, and like this is what, there's like a street vendor, and the
Mhm.
street vendor is like selling some lottery tickets in Costa Rica. So then I write in the song, the song he's singing, selling his wares.
Mhm.
And that to me creates a page that's almost more like a graphic novel, or a comic book page, or an
Yeah, it's more
infographic.
storytelling. Yes,
Yes,
versus yeah, and there is an
exactly.
argument for that. There's a lot of people that suggest story, tell the story about where you are more than drawing
Mm,
the picture, and that
hmm.
definitely is in nature journaling. I mean, we actually, have an urban sketching outing every month to the zoo. We sketch at the zoo
Ooh.
each month
Mm-hmm.
because it's open all year round. It
Mm-hmm.
gets cold here though, so we actually went to the museum center this month
Mm-hmm.
because it was too cold to be outside. But and that's really interesting to observe the animals and sketch
Mm-hmm.
different areas there. So I think there is a huge amount of overlap. A lot of stuff I teach is kind of putting sequential type story in your sketchbook
Ooh.
or your sketching practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really helpful, like it helps you. It's almost that also ends up, when you're talking about nature journaling, that's the journal part too, where you're actually
Mm-hmm.
writing down because that's something I've had to actually integrate more because I tend to draw and not do as much writing. I think that it's
Mm-hmm.
just maybe an aspect of my personality that I tend to write a very short, abbreviated way.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been trying to do more.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
totally
I think
separate practice in some ways,
Yeah, I think
at least for me.
we can settle into habits, and whether it's
Hmm.
from like this is our personality or what. I think this is where the self-awareness part is really important, and I think journaling is the best tool actually for work on this. But I think a lot of times we don't really know why we do things a certain way, and we'll come up with explanations, kind of rationalizing them. And so I think this is dangerous because, someone might always, draw, flowers, and they just draw, sort of like the Victorian, what is it? The Nature Diaries of an Edwardian
Oh
Lady, and it's
yes.
like, it's some beautiful script
Yeah.
of the plant name. Then there's like a watercolor flower with the leaf and everything
Hmm.
like that. Um, and if you just do that on all of your pages, or you do the exact same version of a building, you like put a building right in the middle of the
Hmm.
page, you do ink, and then you do watercolor, and then you put the date, if you do that all the time, you might come up with, like, your brain is good at coming up with stories of why you do things a certain way. And you might say, oh, well, I don't like writing, or I feel less comfortable with this, or this is a better, faster, whatever. You'll have these explanations that might not be true at all.
Hmm.
It might just be sort of this habit that has kind of formed. And if that prevents you from trying new things, or sometimes people try a new thing and at first it feels uncomfortable, and then they associate that with, like, oh, this, I shouldn't do this.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
you get stuck, and you might not actually be what you want. It might not really be in alignment with your real values for why you're doing the sketching in the first place. And I think
Yeah.
this is the trap. You mentioned before
I'm gonna write
monetizing
that down too.
everything.
Yeah. Try new things. I think that's the
Yeah.
name of the episode. All right, keep going.
You mentioned before the sort of monetizing of everything and people turning everything into a side gig. And I think that is a trap also, because a lot of people start sketching or nature journaling because it's fun, or because maybe they're meeting people, or they're getting out, they're doing something different, they're using their creativity, and then they start posting on social media, or maybe selling some of their sketches or watercolors or whatever. And then next thing you know, they're judging they're judging the quality of what they're doing based on how many likes they get, or how many pictures they sell. And so then it suddenly is not the, like, original reason why they were doing that in the first place, and we can sometimes kind of lose track of why we're doing something.
Really doing it as a practice is what should come first and not worrying about if other people will like it. And thinking about as mindfulness and also as observing the world around you. I mean, there's a lot you can learn, especially where you were talking about being in the rainforest, but even in any place, you notice how the climate's changing and how animals are migrating differently. And there's a lot
Mhm.
that's happening that if you pay attention, you notice. That really is an endorsement of the practice because some people don't notice something's happening if they don't look at it.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I've noticed, I mean, one story that I have about this is, as a kid, I spent a lot of time in nature. I also, like, read books about nature. So I feel like I was pretty knowledgeable, and pretty connected, and pretty observant. And so, my dad moved to Costa Rica when I was a little kid, and I would spend a lot of time down there as a kid, but I didn't nature journal. And I did drawing, but I didn't really draw things that I saw in real life. I drew like dragons and imaginary stuff. And the first time I went back to Costa Rica after I started nature journaling, I went around nature journaling and in the exact same places I had explored, I had probably spent, hundreds of hours in some of these places. And I went back with a nature journaling perspective, and I saw so many things that I had never seen before. Saw so much deeper, and so many like bird species that I don't even remember noticing before. And part of me could come up with an explanation like, oh, look, there's more birds here than there were before. But I don't think it was the birds, it was me. And so going back with this new tool, I like to say nature journaling is like binoculars. It's a tool for seeing. And going back with that tool, I saw a lot more, even though I thought that I was seeing a lot before.
It really is true. It's sort of like there's a world that's hidden in plain sight when you're
Mhm,
not observing it.
mhm,
And that's kind of exciting. Tell me a little bit about what your plans are. Are you doing more traveling? What is your future? And then we'll get into your
mhm.
socials and where people can follow you and Patreon and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, so this year, I'm gonna be going to the Southern California desert here in a couple days. There's some wildflowers and stuff that I want to. I went last year as well and made some videos about it, but I'm gonna be going back, hopefully catching more of the interesting botanical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm gonna film some Skillshare videos as well. I haven't
Mm.
tried that before, but I'm gonna try making some nature journaling videos on Skillshare to help because I am full-time nature journaling, so this is my job
Mm-hmm.
also. So I do have to figure out ways of monetizing. Then I am going to be for sure in June and July, I'm going to be in the Galapagos again because I'm helping develop a nature journaling curriculum there. Lots of people don't know, but there's like 30 to 40,000 people live in the Galapagos Islands, and currently we're working on getting nature journaling in all of the schools and already made some really big steps last year towards that. And I'm going to be going to do some more follow-up work on that. Then I'm going to be on the Amazonian part of Ecuador in like August, September, maybe October. I'm going to be leading a nature journaling trip there. So I haven't announced this too many places yet, but soon more information will be coming out about it. But I'm going to be leading a nature journaling adventure going from the Andes to the Amazon, lots of cool places in between.
Oh,
Um,
amazing.
yeah, so more information coming out about that soon. I'll be doing some collaborations with a couple of research organizations and stuff down there. Just lots of nature journal, lots of new videos for the Nature Journal show as well. And then November and December, I'll be in Costa Rica again. So similar pattern to this year. I'll be teaching nature journaling, and I'll also be leading a nature journaling trip there in December. So first week of December, it's going to be a little bit more of a luxurious one than the Ecuador one, and a little
Mm-hmm.
bit less like hiking and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be in early December, and that's pretty much the plan. Hopefully, lots of tree climbing and nature journaling in the trees as well.
Oh, that
Um,
sounds exciting.
yeah,
And so where can people follow you if they're interested in finding out about these journal trips?
Yeah, well, the best, I mean, if you can spell my last name, Peifer, then you can find me anywhere online. I'm always just Marley Peifer, no spaces, no slashes, no periods. Marley Peifer. I'm on Instagram is usually a good place. My YouTube has my best content right now. MarleyPeifer.com is my website. I'm also on, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Tumblr,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
all of those different things. But Instagram, YouTube, and website are the best.
Okay, great. Well, thank you
Hmm.
so much. It's great to finally get to talk to you after feeling
Yeah,
for months. I mean, but it's been totally worth it for all of your adventures. I mean,
yeah,
I've been watching with envy. I'm a bit of a travel addict, but I can only do so much a year. But thanks so much for being on the show.
yeah, no problem.